We turn now to a discussion of the topic of sexual abuse specifically for the remainder, most of the remainder at least, of the discussion in Glicken's chapter 8. Sexual abuse is defined as sexual assault on or the sexual exploitation of a minor. Now, exploitation has a lot of different implications, and I think I just want to say here that it's important to keep in mind that in cases of sexual abuse of a minor, we're really talking about somebody who is older and has more sophistication than the child. And so while at times sexual abuse can involve force and be assaultive in nature, it is not necessarily so. And in fact, you will find, I believe, in the course of your work that most of the cases of child molestation really is quite different from cases of rape, in that the dynamics differ greatly. Rather than forcing an individual into a sexual act, however that might be done in the cases of sexual assault, in child molestation, the victim is essentially seduced uh, into the behaviors. And so one of the things that is particularly harmful in many of these situations, at least, is that the child, who on one level or another likely feels that what's going on is not right, that it's wrong, the child feels some measure of responsibility often for what happened, and some shame and guilt. And that is one of the things that actually the molester knows works very effectively to prevent the child from reporting what happened. And so again, as we go along in this discussion, this will become a little clearer, I think, to you. But there's a broad range of behaviors, from a series of acts over a long period of time to one single incident. Child molestation generally progresses on a gradual scale, and so when a child is molested, usually the individual just doesn't start out with sexual penetration, for instance, but has probably spent a good deal of time grooming. We call it grooming his victim or her victim, through a series of kinds of things that normalizes maybe first close physical presence, second discussion about sexual matters, thirdly touching in just in general, then touching in more private areas, then undressing, then touching genital areas, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is generally a progression of behaviors that moves that child along this continuum, let's say, that eventually the child is a willing participant, so to speak. Again, understand, we do not give the victim equal standing in this. It's not a relationship. It is child molestation. It's exploitation and abuse. But this is really how child molesters tend to engage their victims in this behavior. And you can see that victims range in age really from infancy through adolescence. And we do have occasions where children are molested as infants during diaper changes and those kinds of things, and all the way through the adolescent period, and includes a number of different kinds of behaviors that you can see here on the slide. This says lewd and lascivious conduct with a child under the age of 14. In Alaska, again, the age of consent is 16, and so sexual abuse really goes, in some states the age of consent is 14, some it is 18 actually, I believe, and in Alaska, again, as I said, under certain circumstances, that is, in a relationship with a person who's in a position of authority, the age of consent is actually 18. But the thing that makes this abuse is that really this is about gratifying the sexual desires of the adult. And that's what motivates this behavior on the adult's part. We're going to talk a little bit about physical abuse and neglect in here as well from time to time, but victims of abuse experience symptoms of PTSD, and this also includes sexual abuse victims as well. Anxiety, irritability, nightmares, impaired concentration, withdrawal from social contacts, those kinds of things. And there's a lot of evidence that we'll touch on in the chapter about social work in the schools that suggests that physical abuse in early childhood years really oftentimes leads to aggressive behavior in those victims later on in life. And victims of physical and sexual abuse are far more likely to enter into relationships later in life with people who have themselves been abused or who will abuse them. And this is one of those treatment issues that victims often find themselves dealing with at different times. The discrete kinds of events, and I say discrete meaning, the identifiable kinds of events when sexual abuse or physical abuse occur, may differ somewhat from the emotional harm that children experience when they witness domestic violence or those kinds of things. And so sometimes the system is quicker to respond to, including law enforcement and social workers, more quick to respond to concerns about physical abuse and about sexual abuse than they are about neglect or emotional harm. But there's a lot of evidence, many studies that suggest that actually chronic emotional abuse or emotional harm and chronic neglect, depending upon the type of neglect, can actually have more severe and longer lasting implications than instances of physical abuse and sexual abuse. And that is not to say that we don't have to worry about the implications of physical or sexual abuse, because we do, but emotional harm and neglect should not be set aside as less severe, because oftentimes it has more severe consequences in the long run. Indications of sexual abuse, will surface sometimes through a broad range of symptoms that I don't really have. We don't have the opportunity here to go into this, and again, I would refer you to a class I'm going to be teaching again, on child abuse, or rather the violence in families, or any number of different kinds of publications where they'll list out signs and symptoms, behavioral signs and symptoms of abuse and neglect. Children oftentimes report sexual activities to their friends first of all, sometimes to a trusted adult, but usually to peers. Peers are oftentimes the first person that hears about it, and kids will make promises sometimes not to tell other people, and then carry around this burden as well. And if they come to you, sometimes they'll ask you if they should keep this secret or not when they think the secret is hurting their friend, and you have to be ready for a response that kind of lets them off the hook for telling. I have to tell you that uneven teeth may be a sign of sexual abuse, particularly in younger children, suggesting prolonged oral sex, and that is, in a certain sense, that makes sense to me, but that's really not something that I have heard much of before, and so this is interesting. You never stop learning in this field, that's for sure. But here it is. Okay. So the abuse, child sexual abuse, and this is true for many other forms of maltreatment as well, can result in health or behavior problems, drug alcohol problems, teen pregnancy and promiscuity, and crime. One of I think the most distressing kinds of things that I have seen in this work is when a young adolescent female has become so sexualized because of ongoing sexual abuse that she appears to be promiscuous. She'll engage in sexual behavior with other people. And there's a number of reasons that might occur that involves that in the child's learning that that's where her self-worth is, and that's what makes her valuable perhaps to other people. So occasionally, not always by any means, but occasionally victims will become promiscuous, and then when the abuse becomes evident and it goes to court and the victim is on the stand, sometimes the jury will judge that adolescent victim is being a bit something like a seductress or whatever, and actually, not convict the perpetrator because of that. And it's important to recognize those behaviors are a result of and never the cause of sexual abuse. Here are some indicators of sexual abuse, some things that you might see in children. And I've said before, I'll say again, remember these are indicators, they're red flags. These are not certain indicators that abuse is occurring, but rather just some indicators we need to be aware of that, among other things, sexual abuse may be actually behind some of these behaviors. So when you see children with age-inappropriate understanding of sexual terms and inappropriate sexual behaviors for a child of that age, a lot of times you should begin to start looking at whether or not something inappropriate has occurred with this child, such as sexual abuse. Now, with the media being what it is today, oftentimes kids are exposed to some very age inappropriate things, and that's another issue involving perhaps parental neglect if that's the case. But sexually abused children oftentimes will kind of communicate some of the things that are going on to them through inappropriate behaviors and understandings of things, and you really have a sense of what kids should know and shouldn't know at certain ages. Curiosity about sexual matters. I mean, again, that children are as they grow and emerge, and things begin to change with their bodies and things, they develop an interest in sexual matters, and again, depending upon what they're exposed to in the media, may have a lot of questions also, even again ahead of their time. This doesn't mean they're being abused, but when there's an extreme curiosity or extreme preoccupation with sexual areas of the body or what sexual matters and things like that, it's oftentimes something that should call your attention to what's been going on. One of the things that's somewhat different about little boys, although not always, but that there is a more of a preoccupation with matters about homosexuality and things like this. Very little boys, some sources that I have studied say, worry that what occurred to them may actually make them a girl, that they're not a boy anymore, and there may be questions about those kinds of things, but because a lot of times usually the perpetrator is another male, little boys fear that sexual interaction implies somehow that they're homosexual or they become homosexual because of that, and so oftentimes need some real professional reassurances in those areas. Kids sometimes are afraid of their parents, and also perpetrators oftentimes threaten their parents that if the kids tell, they'll hurt their parents or they'll hurt their pets or hurt their siblings and things like that. So there can be a lot of unnatural fears of individuals or things that are going to happen to those individuals. Eating disorders are not uncommon among victims. False maturity or age inappropriate behaviors. Bedwetting among older children sometimes can be an indication of sexual abuse, although I have to say enuresis is one of those things that occurs for a number of different reasons. But as the editors or the authors point out here, I mean, they can be a sort of a defense against somebody crawling into bed with them at night. Sleep problems, inability to concentrate, withdrawing from activities, any significant changes in behavior that seem new and abrupt, and those kinds of things. These are all indicators of many problems, but among them sexual abuse. Child victims often don't want to report abuse because they experience quite a bit of guilt and shame. Unlike cases of sexual assault, sexual molestation, victims are often seduced into the behaviors, and so by the time and the perpetrator has really taken that child through a progression of behaviors we call grooming, that starts from simple arranging to be alone with that child, to perhaps sitting next to the child, to maybe watching something on television that's a little inappropriate, then beginning to have more bodily contact with the child, then touching the child in more private areas, maybe walking around without being fully clothed around the child, and going into the bathroom when the child's in the bathroom, perhaps wrestling around with a child and then maybe beginning to touch genitals accidentally and then on purpose. You see how perpetrators generally set this thing up as sort of there's just a gradual normalization of events and behaviors and attitudes and things that lead up to the sexual abuse itself. And so by the time that that occurs, the child is although the child, I think, in most cases, has a sense that something is wrong about this, there's a certain level of familiarity with it, so that it becomes easier for the molester to harm the child. And so, when it comes time to report, the child is very possibly believing that he or she is as responsible for it as the perpetrator. That happens often. The other thing is that is very sad but true about this is that we tend to believe adults before we believe kids, and this is just equally true in child protection investigations and in law enforcement investigations and court hearings. We tend to discredit what kids say. Now, older children sometimes, the literature will tell you that you need to keep your eyes open as you deal with the allegations made by older children when there's a possibility that there's some manipulative value in their making a false report. But by no means should that be fodder for you to discount the reports of older children and adolescents, because usually those kids are going to be telling you the truth. Younger children who report sexual abuse in particular are almost never telling you a lie. Younger kids don't make stories up about these things. They don't have the capacity to do that if they haven't been exposed to these things. Older children, have more exposure to things, and again, depending upon what a secondary gain might be from a report, and I just say this as a sort of an aside, something you need to be aware of. But with younger children, you can almost always count on it. I mean, and even with older kids, almost always count on this being the truth. And if we don't believe those kids when we do these investigations, I don't know who will. And so you see, kids have a sense that adults are believed more than they are, and so a lot of times, for good reason, they don't report. With older children, you see behavior or some ranges of behaviors, from really fear of topics of things like of even discussions about sexual behaviors to possible promiscuous behaviors, as I'd mentioned earlier, poor hygiene to being excessively clean, having difficult relationships with peers and poor interpersonal skills, isolating themselves perhaps, feeling depressed and withdrawn, running away, acting out, aggressive antisocial behaviors. All these kinds of things can result from, can be indicators of sexual abuse, and are problems that result sometimes from being abused sexually. You'll oftentimes see school problems with these kids, including frequent absences and behavioral problems in the classroom, falling asleep in the classroom. At times, that falling asleep in the classroom, for instance, they may have been awake and vigilant all night because they're afraid that the perpetrator is going to come to their bed, and so they don't want to be taken by surprise. Not wanting to undress and shower in gym, for instance, might be another thing. Not wanting to participate in any kind of contact sports with other kids, all those kinds of things. So, but again, when you see these kinds of things, don't assume that sexual abuse is occurring just because these symptoms are noted in their behaviors. They're symptoms that could indicate other problems not related to sexual abuse, but they should be taken as red flags to keep your eyes open and put it together with other things you know about the child and the family in determining whether or not this is something that is of concern. Incest is a term that we don't really use a lot in the profession, although it's the term that I think the public's most familiar with. Everybody knows what incest is, the close sexual interactions among people of a close biological relationship. When we talk about intrafamilial abuse, that kind of extends it to step relations and those, and perhaps even adoptive relations and things like that, boyfriends of parents and those kinds of things. Incest, is one of those supposedly universal taboos that virtually every society, with one or two exceptions, indicate that sexual contact between close relatives above a certain degree is just totally unacceptable, is actually revolting, is considered to be in most societies and things. Um, so in any event, oftentimes you'll have reports that it's the father or some man acting as the parent that's the initiator, and girls are the most frequent victims of these contacts. But we do believe that boys are more frequent victims than are reported. If you remember again the reasons why sometimes boys are reluctant to report. And the other thing is, I think in our society, well, I don't think, I know in our society that the definitions of traditional masculinity says that a real man, and in this case a real boy, because little boys know this too, that boys are supposed to like sex, boys are supposed to be in charge, boys can't be victims, or they're not really masculine. And so there's a number of different reasons why boys who have been molested, aside from all those other things that we talked about, they're gonna keep it to themselves oftentimes. And so there is more and more we're finding out that more boys are victims than, and also as this slide suggests, that younger boys in particular tend to be victims of multiple forms of abuse at a younger age than girls. And kids that are victimized in multiple forms of abuse tend to be hurt more seriously than those that are victims of just one type of abuse or neglect when you look at them in the long run. There is some reason to believe that the younger the age of onset of sexual abuse, that the long-lasting impact is more harmful and serious. Now, think back to an earlier lecture in this class where we talked about how social workers kind of gather their information and things like that. There are some studies that suggest this, but some people think this is a myth. My own experience suggests that it's not a myth. But again, I'm talking about anecdotes here, and I'm not telling you statistics. But I will tell you that it makes sense to me, based on my experience, that things that happen to you in younger years form a foundation for everything later. Everything is built on things that happen to us as a young child. And so if your trust in adults is so destroyed by an adult who is supposed to be taking care of you actually exploiting you and taking advantage of you and using you for his or her own sexual gratification, if that happens at a certain age, a very young age, that's going to impact your ability to form bonds with other individuals from a very early age on. So repressed memory syndrome is something, there's some controversy around this topic because there's a lot of people who want us to believe that therapists who aren't making progress with clients decide that these clients must have been molested as kids, and so they begin to kind of explore in therapy who might have molested the child, and suddenly this memory comes forward that a lot of people believe only happened because the therapist planted the idea and that it really didn't occur. Now, that's sort of one movement that wants us not to believe in these things. However, I've talked to clients myself over the years who have told me about this dissociation that went on with them as they were being victimized, that they knew this was wrong and they knew it was unacceptable, and so they kind of just check out psychologically while it's going on, and it's sort of like it's not really happening to them. They're thinking about something else, and that thing that happens to them sort of becomes a part of them that isn't them, and you can imagine the kind of the fragmenting of a person's psyche that would occur when that kind of process goes on. Now, multiple personality disorders come to mind when you think about that, and it may be true that multiple personality disorders have this traumatic event such as this. Maybe all of them do in their background. I don't know, but I can tell you that not everybody who dissociates and who has memories that they block out are multiple personality disorders by any stretch of the imagination. But things are just so traumatic that they push it aside, and they genuinely do not remember that. Now, you see a lot of different kinds of symptoms and problems that can come from repressed memory syndromes, a lot of relationship problems sometimes, and individuals who perhaps have been molested as children who have blocked it out, who have a fear of closeness and sexual intimacy with their adult partners, and it impacts their marriage perhaps. Another thing, panic attacks. A panic attack is, severe anxiety, and there's physical responses. Sometimes people feel like they're going to die or they're going to pass out. They can't catch their breath. Sometimes maybe they do pass out, and but they start breathing, of course, as soon as they've passed out. But in any event, that there's nobody knows why they're having this panic attack. It just starts up in unpredictable times. And it's very likely that there's some cue in the environment, whether it's a smell or a sound, a song playing on the radio, perhaps the way the light of the sun just kind of bounces off of a window into a room or something like this. But there's some obscure little cue probably that touches on memories that may have been repressed, that are associated with severe anxiety and trauma, and so that generates that. This is just one theory, but I think it's something that's very possible that this is what happens. And so you can kind of see the kinds of things that might happen as the result of repressed memory. And sometimes when victims are in treatment, these are the kinds of things that are addressed. Now, I will tell you too that most of the studies that I'm aware of tell you that if you're a victim of sexual abuse or physical abuse or neglect, that doesn't mean that you're going to be an abuser yourself. While it may be true that most abusers have been victims, most victims are not abusers, and certainly this doesn't happen to every victim. So, but many victims, in fact, I think one study I read one time said that 2/3 of the victims that don't get treatment function very successfully and happily in life and don't have any major psychological problems. And so this is not to say this occurs with everybody, but for those victims who do experience problems, this is something that is sometimes a part of the complex of issues that you deal with them. So one of the things that this tells you is that therapists who are working with sexual abuse victims, especially adult victims who are molested as children, oftentimes will be looking for, working with the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, because we've come to realize that victimization, childhood victimization, really results in a PTSD set of complex issues and problems that need to be resolved. I can tell from the discussion board on the topic of who social workers, social work students imagine themselves having the most difficulty working with it. Sexual abuse perpetrators tend to be at the top of the list here. Not a lot of students seem to want to work with them at this stage in their career. I can tell you, because I worked with sexual abuse perpetrators, both adults and adolescents, and mostly, well, not mostly, but in particular during the years I was at the mental health center working as a therapist, and I can tell you it's a very interesting field to work in, and a fascinating field. One thing to keep in mind is we cannot resolve the issues of sexual abuse if we don't work with perpetrators too. We have to treat perpetrators, and although there's no cure, so to speak, for sexual abuse, it's like alcoholism. There isn't a cure for alcoholism, but what the alcoholic learns is what to do to avoid having further problems because of their alcoholism. Likewise with sexual offenders, you don't cure their sexual offending tendencies. You teach the sex offender in treatment what his high-risk situations are, and I say his because they're not always males, but frequently, and for the purpose of this discussion, most frequently they are. What their high-risk situations are, what they need to do when they get in those high-risk situations, and those kinds of things, so that a sex offender who has had successful treatment is going to be able to tell you his high-risk situations and be able to tell you things like that he can't be around kids and those kinds of things. And so anyway, I would just tell you that this client population is really needs people who are willing to work with them and to help them, and it can be a very rewarding work. But it's also an area where you need to be very aware of the techniques. This is a field, is an emerging field as far as treatment goes, and there really is a sort of a specific set of things you do in treatment. It's one of the reasons that I found that working with perpetrators actually was more interesting, was the fact that it's pretty well spelled out how you work with perpetrators, and so there's not a lot of guessing around about what you need to do. So anyway, just something for you to think about. They are a population that needs treatment, and social workers do work with people that no one else wants to work with. That's one of the things we do. And there's a list of characteristics here about perpetrators, and I will tell you: poor impulse control, low self-worth, poor tolerance for frustration, needs for quick gratification, anger, addictive personalities, low levels of guilt. Perpetrators don't have much in terms of empathy. They can't really put themselves in the spot of their victims, and so one of the things you do in treatment is to help them build empathy skills. And this is something that you can learn. You can teach and learn. But in any event, don't take this as the definitive description of perpetrators, but because by no means is it definitive or complete. It is some of the qualities of perpetrators, and this says that they share three deviant attitudes. There are more than three deviant attitudes, but here's three of them anyway. One is they believe in the concept of male sexual entitlement. One of their thinking errors is basically that they have a right to sex, that they have a right to be gratified, that other people are around to tend to them, and once again, going back to the very traditional definitions of masculine behavior and masculine attitudes, this is right where this comes from. This idea that women are here to serve us, and not only women, but children as well. Children are our possessions, that we are really the ones who deserve the most reward, and when we want something, we should be given that. And that if we're a real man, we get it when we want it, and all those kinds of things. This all comes from traditional male socialization, and that's another part of the treatment process, is changing some of those really grievous thinking errors that lead to sexual molestation and abuse. They perceive children as sexually attractive and motivated to experience sex. This is not true about all perpetrators of incest, but probably for the largest part. We're talking here about the regressed offender, and this is an individual who is primarily attracted to people of his own age for sexual gratification, and yet in times of stress, which tend to be pretty frequent for them, they regress to earlier levels of development, and so they see children almost as an equal level to them, or these adolescents as an unequal level to them, or perhaps in their minds they have attributed more adult qualities to these young people, so that they're more like an adult to them, but so that their primary sexual attraction is still to adults of their own age, but they feel inadequate in those relationships, and so they regress and seek out the gratification and total acceptance of young children, because children are easy to please. Adults aren't. And so this is another area that is one of those things that you work with sex offenders, and also that they minimize the harm caused by their sexual abuse. Not only do they minimize the harm, they convince themselves, this is another one of their thinking errors, that they're educating the children, or that the children love them, and that they're not really hurting them. A child molester will look at you straight in the eye and say, I would never do anything to hurt this child, even when they admit that they may have molested, or that they molested the child. Keep in mind, they just aren't fonts of empathy, and they really don't have the capacity nor the inclination to really much care about what the child is going through here. Well, we've been talking about OCS in the state of Alaska and other states. Of course, the Child Protective Services agencies have other names, but The CPS agency is primarily a state, usually a state agency, almost always, at least for the investigations ends of things. There have been some efforts on states' part to privatize some of this, to have private agencies actually providing services, but they tend to be more for the reunification and not so much for the investigations in some states. But in most states, it's still a government function, and state and federal funding are used to provide for those services, and also to provide some guidelines. So the federal government comes through every so often and reviews each state's child protective services programs, and states almost always fail, and that's by design. They want to raise the bar high enough that CPS agencies around the nation do better, and so lots of press about how when the feds came into Alaska some years ago, how we failed in, I don't know, 24 of 26 areas or something like that, and that's the case in most of their state reviews. It's just it is, and they told us this is by design because they want the states to do better, and so they set the bar high so that it's really difficult to achieve that, and then have the states continuing to work to improve over the next few years to reach that bar until they come back the next time and start them all over again. So there's a lot of requirements and regulations and guidelines that the states have to follow. Law enforcement is usually involved in first detecting child abuse, and is often involved in the investigations along with child protection agencies. Hospitals, schools, private therapists, doctors, nurses, teachers, other social workers, all are mandated reporters, as we had talked about earlier, legally obligated to report abuse, and really are major sources of referrals to CPS. In some states, you have to have a master's in social work degree to be a child protection worker, but I'm talking specifically about Alaska. Some years ago, the legislature passed the social work licensing laws that we discussed in an earlier lecture. And one of the purposes, the intents of that, was that the individuals hired by the state child protection agency would be social workers. But the schools weren't turning out enough social work graduates, and those individuals who were graduating with BSWs, many of them, well, not enough of them at least, did not want to work in child protection, and so it became necessary for the agency to develop another class of workers called the Children's Services Specialist, and they're doing the same work that the social workers were doing, but making less because they weren't licensable. And of course, that's not going to last for long, particularly in a state where there are unions and workers' unions, and so that all kind of got scrapped, and the state reclassified the child protection workers to call them protective services specialists. Now and many of the PSSs, the protective services specialists, are social workers, but there are many who have degrees in other fields like human services and psychology, sociology, human development, teaching, forestry, even, some unrelated fields as well. And so I have to tell you, I have a bias, I must admit, being a social worker, but I think many of my colleagues would agree with this, that while every discipline has something to bring to the field in child protection, the social work degree is the best one for this field. It just seems that they're the best prepared to do the kinds of things, that have the skills they need to have in order to do this job well. Others certainly bring other things to it, and can certainly learn and become very good child protection workers as well. Social workers have things to learn in the field, in this job as well, but that's just kind of my thoughts about that. And we've been talking about what we do. You investigate these reports, you work to reunify, you work to keep children in the home. When you can't keep them in the home, you go to court and you provide testimony, and you help the Attorney General build a case to keep that child out of the home until the parents have been able to do the things that they need to do in their case plan to be able to provide a safe environment for the children. And as soon as the safety threats are removed from that home, the children should go back. there is a sense in the community that CPS workers can just go out and rip kids away from their families and never return them again, and nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing. Um, Social work intervention when you with kids that have been molested, again, there's going to be medical individuals and psychological professionals involved as well, people that are hopefully legal individuals who will work with the kids to help them prepare for the possibility that they may have to testify. Oftentimes, we're able to get families to reach an agreement with us so that kids don't have to go on the stands. But there are just grisly times when children are put on the stands to have to testify with their father sitting there in the courtroom about what daddy did. And it's very hard and difficult for kids. Some states have allowed what in camera kinds of things where children go in and talk to the judge in their chambers, and it's taped so that other people can see it, but they don't have to see the perpetrator while they're giving their statement, and it's kind of less formal. But that's not the case in this state, and I haven't heard it proposed in all the years that I've been here, unfortunately. Sometimes we get the perpetrator out of the home, but even if the perpetrator is arrested, and you'll find usually, and I do say usually, the perpetrators in your cases are not going to be arrested. The law enforcement has to have a higher degree of legal proof in order to remove a perpetrator from the home to convict somebody criminally. Then we have to get kids out of the home to remove them. We don't have to. We don't have we have a lower legal standard to be able to protect kids than law enforcement needs to convict someone of a crime. And so oftentimes perpetrators are not arrested, they're not convicted, and they stay in the home. We can, as a child protection agency, have the perpetrator move out if we believe the other parent will protect the children and make sure that the perpetrator stays out. So that's an alternative. It's always better to get the perpetrator to move out rather than to take the child away from the family, because I've mentioned earlier, when you remove a child, you create all sorts of other traumas that kids are going to have to deal with for the rest of their lives as well. Throughout the state, child advocacy centers are emerging now that bring the professionals all the professionals that are involved in these cases together, particularly in cases of sexual abuse, but also in cases of severe physical abuse, and can be in other cases as well. So that the child, particularly in sexual abuse cases, is interviewed one time by a forensic interviewer, while the law enforcement agency and the social worker and perhaps the tribal advocate and the medical people sit behind the one-way mirror and watch that interview. And so they don't have to interview this child over and over and over again. The medical exam generally has trained nurses called sexual assault nurse examiners who know exactly what to look for and have the particular kinds of equipment necessary to be able to confirm whether or not abuse occurred that most doctors don't have, and the training that most doctors don't have in recognizing those signs. You'll oftentimes have mental health professionals on the team as well. This is what's called a multidisciplinary team, an MDT, and more all of the people involved, the legal people, the medical people, the psychological people, the social work people, the interviewers, all those kinds of things, all are getting together in this team and follow up on these cases from month to month so that we look for gaps in what's going on and try to get those gaps filled as we meet from month to month to talk about our cases until they're closed finally. So in this discussion, mostly I've been talking about Kenai, and I want you to understand that most of this is going on all around the state, and many of my students, I realize, are from Anchorage and other, the Valley and other parts of particularly South Central Alaska, but really everywhere. And so although I'm talking specifically about my particular area, I think you can generalize most of what I tell you to your area as well. I mean, so please don't think that this discussion is quite as parochial as it may sound from time to time. If you have any questions about any of this material, as always, I hope you'll contact me. Otherwise, we'll talk again in the future. Thank you.